Well, hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Ascension Speed Show. I'm Lyft, and I'm also joined by Captain Scotch. Hello, Scotch.
Hey there, how y'all doing?
And we are also joined by the Erosion Seeker. Hello, Tess.
Hello.
Well, thank you all for joining. We're going to be covering the Summer Challenge Path, Low Key Summer, and then after that, the Gray Goo Challenge Path. So to begin, we're just going to give a brief overview of what Low Key Summer was about and some of the differences. The biggest major difference is if you went to the Naughty Sorceress's Tower, you saw that there were 23 additional locks. You had to get these keys by adventuring in their respective zones for 12 turns. So that was 11 turns of delay, and then on the 12th turn, you would get the key encounter. And all of these delay zones, most of them, if not all, were off of your normal critical path that you would have in a standard run. So this led to a ton of extra delay on top of the council quests, approximately 265 extra turns of delay. So this was a long path to play. Scotch, what were some of the key keys determine the foundation, or we built our route around obtaining these as quickly as possible?
One of the biggest ones was the Black Rose key, which you got in the Haunted Conservatory. You wanted to get that as early as possible so that you leveled up your professor faster and just had a nice, familiar accessory. It also was nice because it dovetailed nicely with completing the Dakota Fanning quest, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. In addition to this, in the Cobb's Knob kitchens, there was a minus 10% combat key, basically like an extra latte since it was an accessory. A very, very good accessory, and one that, unlike in normal runs, you would actually want to unlock the knob as quickly as possible so that you could run back down there and get that minus 10% combat. One that was not necessary to get immediately, but was one that you wanted to get pretty quickly was the deep fried key in the Madness Bakery. Gave you an additional 15 sleaze damage, as well as 30 sleaze spell damage, which is effectively a plus 45 for the Zeppelin non-combats, which is quite a nice boost and helped change around the needs for sleaze spell damage in that path. A few of the more controversial keys include the treasure chest key, which we'll talk a bit about later. This was in the below decks for the pirates, and it was a plus 30% items, plus 30% meat key. So one of the best accessories in the game for items, and it helped you out with nuns too. The question was, do you go through the hassle of getting pirates finished early to access it, or do you just push that off till the end of the run? Most of the other keys were not super helpful. There was a 50% meat key. Actually, there were two 50% meat keys, but you usually couldn't get both of those before nuns anyway. And then you had a bunch of keys that were like damage absorption and plus 5 stats per fight, etc.
There are the monster level keys. Those are pretty useful.
Yes, that one was nice too. In the Focal, I believe, as well as the Funhouse, both of those had monster level. One was plus 10 and the other was plus 20.
And the path reward for Low Key Summer is also worth mentioning. It's a skill book called Manual of Lockpicking, which gives you a skill that grants you one of the 3 hero keys. So, for instance, you could get a Sneaky Pete key instantly. This reward will continue to drop as a path reward. So if you complete Low Key Summer, you can get this skill book for yourself or buy it from the mall.
It will keep dropping until the skill itself is no longer standard in 2023.
There was some divergences from your typical standard routing. For instance, how you went about unlocking the hidden temple. What was one of our first divergences?
This was something that people discovered basically day one of the path. Because you had to go into the Haunted Conservatory, people decided that you might as well pick up the Dakota Fanning route, which meant not doing the Spooky Forest nonsense in exchange for getting the Conservatory fertilizer, the daily dungeon sewing kit, and the bendy straw from your third fallen archfiend.
It was really, really important, especially since the Black Rose key, something you wanted to get right away, that you did not burn the Black Rose Conservatory delay before you talked to Dakota Fanning. Why is that, Scotch?
So that was an error that I made in one of my early runs. I just misclicked, thought that I had already talked to Dakota, had not. The reason that you don't want to do that is that the Dakota Fanning is one of those quests that you can't pre-burn delay. So if you were to, say, get the Black Rose key and then talk to Dakota Fanning, you would find that all of those 12 turns you had already spent in the zone did not count towards the 10 turns of delay that you needed to burn in order to get the fertilizer. When it happens, it's a 10-turn mistake is pretty dang bad when it comes to speedrunning. So that was a painful one.
Does anyone remember off the top of your head what stat was required so you could talk to Dakota Fanning?
30 stat exactly, I believe. That was an annoying one where it was easy to overlook, very easy to do, but you had to actually remember that you needed it, or else you would be just sort of slightly confused. It was actually kind of funny that it wasn't level locked. Most quests in the game are locked to level, not just a specific stat quantity.
And why did Moxie classes have it so hard this path?
Moxie classes have, I would say, got pretty rough go of it in most recent challenge paths, but this one was especially egregious. So there was a key in the funhouse which required that you actually progress your guild quest. That meant that you had to open the guild. The muscle classes always get a free guild unlock because their guild is within a zone that you have to burn delay in anyway. In this path, they did actually give mist classes a free unlock too, as there was a key in the Haunted Pantry, the zone that you use to unlock the mist guild. They did not put a key, however, in the Sleazy Back Alley, which meant that Moxie classes, in addition to the extra 265 turns of delay, also had to go and unlock their guild for an extra 4 to 5 turns of delay on top of that, which, not ideal. Putting one class at a 5 to 6 turn disadvantage, depending on your RNG, is not usually ideal for a speed class, especially if that class is already struggling for other reasons.
Another shakeup to our normal route is typically we use harem. Instead of the harem route, the Knob Elite outfit. Why is that, Tess?
So in this path, because there was a key in the haunted kitchen, you had to spend 12 turns in that zone. Normally, you would want to spend your first semi-rare in, for example, the Hidden Temple for 3 stone wool, but in this path, what you could do was unlock the Cobb's Knob early, and then in your first semi-rare window, spend all of those turns in the kitchen, which means you don't need to spend a fortune cookie. And when you do that, you get the key, but also you get the Elite Guard Captain, and then you equip that outfit and spend 3 more turns in the kitchen, hopefully before the 11 turns of delay, so you get the Knob Cake, and then that lets you fight the boss on top of getting the key.
And you brought up a really good point about removing the need to eat a fortune cookie, which was a huge deal. Essentially, that let you get an entire extra pizza by skipping that one fullness fortune cookie.
And some people, myself, went even farther and ate 0 fortune cookies, although we'll talk a little bit more about that later, because that was a very strange decision that I made personally.
Finally, we typically do the shore to unlock the island in a standard run. What was different about Low-Key Summer?
One of the neat things about Low-Key Summer was that there was a relatively useful key that required that you adventure in the old landfill. In that zone, you can get a number of funky junk keys, and once you get 3 of those and a
Worse Homes and Gardens catalog.
Once you get those, you're able to build yourself a boat to get you to the island. One of the reasons that you don't usually do that is that these are essentially the same as the Spooky Raven drops. They're extremely low drop rate, at least on your first try, but a easier to reach drop rate every single time you miss the drop. Usually, it's not really worth it to do it in a normal run because it costs too much in terms of item drop. But in Low-Key Summer, you already had to spend 11 turns in that zone, which meant that you weren't really trying for 5% drops. You were more trying for a number of different 10 to 15% drops, which was a lot easier. It wasn't super difficult to actually get that within the delay by devoting a little bit of your item drop resources to that test. As a result, you were able to unlock the mysterious island without actually accessing the shore at all, which was a nice little perk from the landfill key.
Now, as far as the differences between a softcore and a hardcore run in Low-Key Summer, well, in softcore, you have pulls, and that meant we were actually able to hit 2 days for softcore. Scotch, we had one of our Discord members do a really turn bloat run. It was impressive. How was that done?
Akadorian did what I consider one of the best runs to appear on a leaderboard ever, and was able to get a bronze button with a 1,000 turn 3-day run. In order to get this pretty impressive 1,000 turn bloat run, Akko accessed Pirate Realm, where Akko had banked a ton of fun from previous runs. The weird thing about Pirate Realm is that the currency that you spend is actually banked across Ascension. The only thing that you need to do to access it is go through the entire Pirate Realm chain. That usually isn't something that you want to do in a standard run because it's a ton of turns to get to the end of Pirate Realm, and nothing in there is particularly useful. Unless you need to turn bloat to a ridiculous extent. Crabsicles are a very good food for turn bloat, and if you've saved up enough and you can buy enough crabsicles to hit your entire diet, no real reason why not to. As a result, Akko decided to have a little bit of fun after clinching that he was going to finish the run in 3 days, and decided to just turn bloat his way to a 1,000 turn leaderboard run, which I still think incredibly impressive.
And then we had the lovely opportunity to do pirates and revisit and wonder why we ever complained that not optimal and we can't do them in a standard run. Boy, are they miserable.
The monkey's paw curls again.
I chose to do them early in the run because I wanted the treasure chest key. So that meant you needed to start the level 11 quest by finishing Black Forest and get access to Below Decks. Insults are the most swingy source of plus turn count in this path.
It is a extremely variable number of turns. I mean, it could take you 6 turns and then you're done. It could take you 20 to 25 pirates until you actually have enough insults to do the dang thing. And even then, when you get enough insults, I don't want to speak for everybody, I definitely was never getting the 7 or 8 insults that you would need to guarantee it. Even when you have enough, your 6 insults, you still have a pretty good chance of failing several non-combats, which is, again, crushing.
6 insults is like a 1 in 3 chance of success. 7 is 62%. Not very good numbers.
No, terrible. A lot of the time in runs, if you get an 80% shot at something, it isn't necessarily great. Speaking of 80% shots, we'll get into this a little bit more in the strategy discussion section as well, but we could talk about it a little bit now. One thing that was really crucial in this path, partly because of Camel being released mid-path, was encountering a green ops soldier in the war. What kind of weird strategies did you all use to guarantee a green ops soldier would appear during the war so that you could spit it and get multiple green smoke bombs in the path?
I don't think there was a guarantee, and that's what was so frustrating about the path. You needed to encounter a green ops soldier, or you just didn't have a shot at a gold run.
Well, I just did the normal-ish thing, which was batter up and human musk on things that had 2 copies, and then just kind of cross my fingers.
By the end of the path, that was what I was doing. I kept trying to figure out if there was some way to kind of cheese it by using batter up more often. And I remember I had one run in particular where I decided to try a really strange version of this strat, and I essentially battered up every combat of the war. That was an interesting idea that did not help at all. Did not hit a green ops soldier. If I had, I probably would have done that horrible thing every single run until the end of the path.
Partway through the path, there was this enormous curveball. Someone posted an image of a extremely optimal food item that had appeared in Chez Snute. What was that?
That was the Eldritch Mushroom Pizza, which grants 1 turn of Eldritch Attunement.
Okay, 1 turn of attunement. How much damage could that really do? Well,
turns out quite a few.
Tess, you used it most successfully. Walk us through what happened that day and how you adjusted your plans. I believe when it first appeared, you were on day 3 of a run in LKS.
That day, I basically couldn't use it because it was already done. But what I could then do was ascend on the same day and take advantage of it for the end of day 1 and the start of day 2. Because that effect only gives you 1 turn, you had to extend it with as many free fights and free kills as possible, which meant using things like the sausage goblins, using your chest x-rays, every attempt to stretch that out for as many key zones as possible. This was further complicated by the Unspeak to, which has a 50% chance to extend every effect you have, 5% after every combat. So what I did was keep the Unspeakachu on, run it through every free fight I had, of which there were about 30 or 40, which gets doubled to 80. And then I had all of my sausage fights, my chest x-rays, everything else. And that gave me a ton of turns of Eldritch Attunement, which I used in all of the delay zones, which sometimes gave even more turns of Eldritch Attunement.
This run was so far ahead of the curve. Was it, 40 turns faster, 50 turns faster than the previous best?
40 turns faster than the previous best. We got a little closer by the end of the season, but this was just incredible execution of a kind of like, I was going to say once in a lifetime, once in a path event, basically. The log for it is a thing of beauty. Conversely, on the softcore board, I actually did a similar thing as you, Tess, in that I wasn't in run that day. I had a number of meetings, so I didn't really get to start until pretty late in the day. I saw that you were doing hardcore and was like, well, someone should try and do softcore. Let's see how it goes. Unfortunately, I had the additional complicating factor of not being able to log on the next day, so I just had to play an entire run from, I believe it was 8 p.m. my time to about 3 a.m. my time the next day. And I just had to hope I could get the run finished in like a pretty compressed period. Also complicating matters, I had never actually done an attunement run before in my life, so I was kind of like, I don't really know exactly how to do this. I vaguely know because I occasionally, like on generic summer holidays, I would put that into my free fight routine, so I knew roughly kind of, okay, here's what it does proc on, here's what it doesn't proc on. One thing that I did not realize, at least, well, now I will never forget, but I did not realize at the time, was that Cocoa of Youth only targets, I believe, 10 effects at maximum. If you have more than that, there is no guarantee it hits the effect that you want. What I ended up having occur was that I ended up having around 15 effects. So, whereas in Softcore, you can use the item Cocoa of Youth to get 5 extra turns of attunement for every pull. For me, it was more like 3 extra turns of attunement for every pull, because I wasn't actually able to guarantee it would hit the effect every time. To make matters worse, Unspeakachu did not want to play along with me, and I got, I believe, 1 activation in around 100 turns of attunement fights. And I got what I would say is a comically bad airship of around 50 turns to get to the final Sid non-combat, which added up to a run that was temporarily in the gold spot for softcore, but was clearly beatable. And Lyft, you put that run out of its misery near the end of the season.
Speaking of the Cocoa of Youth, this was really funny during the Eldritch Mushroom Day because it meant you could essentially pull an arbitrary number of items that saved 5 turns each, which friend of the show, Akadorian, did for a 2/747.
Yeah, no, Akko turned bloated on both boards and did a really good job of it.
That's amazing. Well, let's move on to strategy of low-key summer. Hands down, Seal Clipper was the best class to play in this path, notably for Batter Up, great as a banish on your second ornate nightstand in the bedroom. Also, I think Retrospecs was an incredibly useful item in this path, especially since you had access to Dire Warn. You could guarantee retrospect drops. If, for instance, you fought something that 100% item, the retrospects, and banished it, you could then go to the Dire Warn and then force the item through retrospects.
So the retrospects are an accessory that help you find items that you did not get in the previous fight, and it does this by rolling for the base drop rate in every future fight that you do not miss a new item in, as long as it's not a conditional item drop. So what this means is if you get, say, a Filthworm Gland to not drop while the retrospects are equipped, you can do 10 fights and you would have a chance of getting that Filthworm Gland. Application for this in Loki Summer is that you also have a lot of zones with high base drop rates that you could exploit the retrospects with. Specifically for the star chart, what you could do was use the Seal Clubber Batter Up to banish both astronomers and keep the star chart in your retrospects. And then immediately on the next fight, you'd have a 100% chance of getting the star chart because the base drop rate is 100%. So you would basically be getting the star chart and banishing the astronomer all at once.
That's, of course, if you were lucky enough to encounter an astronomer, at least at the time, was the only way to ensure you got a star chart for the Richard Star Key.
One other interesting perk of Seal Clubber that is important beyond Astro Batter and just the great usage of Batter Up was the Claw of the Infernal Seal. The Claw of the Infernal Seal is a accessory, nominally, but you don't actually use it as an accessory. The only thing you're really using it for is that it allows you to fight 5 more Infernal Seals per day. The advantage to this is that Tess's point about the retrospects, Infernal Seal fights are fantastic retrospects fights. In addition to that, they're also horrors. Well, one of them is. I believe it is Spawn of Wally, is a horror, and by pulling this claw, you get 5 free horrors per day, which, combined with the free tentacle that you get every day, essentially means you're pulling 1 item to get an extra Powdered Madness. If your run takes longer, you may end up getting another 2 Powdered Madness out of it. The Powdered Madness is a snapper drop that you get for horrors. The item itself is a free kill, and obviously free kills are pretty great, especially in a path where you ended up getting a Eldritch Attunement chance.
Another fun piece of tech was if you ascended on a day that the bounty hunter wanted Plaque of Locus, you could accept that quest, get yourself a free brandy that you could drink to round out your liver and also get an extra 30% bonus item drop.
And it is worth noting that booze in Standard right now is not in a particularly great place, to the point where the bounty hunter booze is actually one of the better boozes you're going to encounter in Run. It's not as good as an Astral Pilsner, obviously, and it's certainly not as good as the epic drinks that we were used to in previous Standard metas. If you ascend on a day when there is a doable bounty, you might want to consider actually just snagging that and potentially doing that for a little bit of extra item and a little bit of extra turn gen. One other nice thing about LKS from this standpoint was that there were a few other things that you could theoretically do. Normal Standard meta, the only thing you can really do is the Plaque of Locusts. I believe in Low-Key Summer there were at least 2 others that were usually off the beaten path, but were actually reasonably doable. Namely the Conservatory bounty, as well as, if you wanted to be really cheeky, the South of the Border bounty.
So we touched on this before, but we all had different tactics to handle the pirates. Tess, do you want to talk about your strategy for pirates first?
My strategy for the pirates was actually to delay it as long as possible. The big issue with the pirates is that while the level 12 quest is active, you cannot interact with the Pirate's Cove at all. And this was a problem for me because it meant if you wanted twice haunted screwdrivers, you had to either get those all before or all after you were finished with the below decks, which needed level 11. I decided to push the pirates way to the end of the path, which was useful for multiple reasons. So the first thing I did was just use heists for the pirate outfit and then boost combat in the cove itself while getting insults to get the key. That was pretty normal. A lot of people shared that strategy. However, the other thing I did, which I'm pretty proud of, was finding a really stupid interaction between the 4-castle Clingy Pirate Banish and the Saber Force. So what you would do there was encounter the Clingy Pirate, use the Force to get 3 more Clingy Pirates, and then use a cocktail napkin against each one while sniffing the 3rd one before doing so. And then go through the poop deck and below decks, and then 20 turns later, you would come back to the forecastle, use the Force again, and use 3 cocktail napkins again, saving 6 turns out of nowhere, because you could get cocktail napkins from the Barney's Bar, and also as a junkie drop from Diabolic Combat Pizzas.
I thought that strategy was very cool.
Yeah.
That was some fantastic tech.
The weird thing there actually was that the Clingy Pirate Banish is not a traditional banish, so you could not actually get extra copies with Olfaction or Mating Call or Latte, and so the Saber was the only way you could really use this.
For my pirates, to save turns acquiring the outfit, I charged up a camel spit, then ensured that the hidden temple was unlocked before I did pirates, and then spat a stone temple pirate, which drops pirate eye patch, and then used a zap wand to attempt to get all 3 parts of the outfit, but I think I only ended up getting 2 parts of the outfit.
What I ended up doing was something relatively similar, but a little bit less swingy. I think
Yeah, I agree.
if I'm looking at your logs, what you ended up doing was you would zap one eye patch, and then you would potentially zap another one in an effort to get the full outfit.
Correct.
By the end of the path, I decided that there was no real chance that a spit was going to be worth it there. You had a pretty high chance of breaking the wand on that last zap, and there just wasn't a great usage there. So what I ended up doing was I heisted one extra eye patch. I zapped that one extra eye patch, and that had me rolling into pirates with 2 out of the 3 outfit pieces. Not ideal. You would kind of prefer to have all 3 so that you can use the full zone for insults, but that was a way to conserve most of my resources, not end up leveraging a spit on it, and being able to save that spit for delay burning or bowlers or any of the other fun things that we use spits on in the path.
Finally, the voters, specifically the Angry Ghost voter monster. That was a huge source of turn savings, which severely limited the amount of runs that we could do in the final 2 weeks of the challenge path because the Angry Ghost didn't show up for 10 days in a row.
There was also the funny aspect of the path where some speedrunners, cough myself, wanted to save our serious runs for August because I was worried about a saber-like situation where the last item of the month completely shook up the path. Obviously, with the lathe, that did not happen. I think it might have been the least impactful item of the month I have ever seen in the last month of a path. I think in one of my runs, I even forgot to get my lathe item in one of the days because they just weren't that useful. It wasn't really doing anything for you.
Gamble whether or not that last item of the month is going to be impactful because it turned out we could have been doing serious gold attempts for 6 weeks instead of 2, giving us more chances for Angry Ghosts. What was so important about Angry Ghosts?
The Angry Ghosts, which are from the 2018 November item of the month, is a 1 out of 5 wandering monster that you get every 11 turns. Whether or not you fight them is optional, but in Standard, and now especially in Loki Summer, the thing to do was to get turd keys from the What's Seein' Whatever Ghost in Abu Peak, and then use those turd keys on your ghosts in any zone that you need to burn delay in. In regular Ascension, this could be only a couple of turns, but in Loki Summer, where you have a glut of delay zones, you could drop an Angry Ghost in any zone you want every 11 turns, and you could do this for 10 or 20 or maybe even 30 turd keys, which some people ended up doing. I'd like to use those in the south of the border because that was a zone with punishingly high non-combat that were never useful. Some people had different ideas. The Knob Shaft is a zone that you want to get a key from that happened to be all ghosts. So what you would do was boost your plus combat to 20% or so, and then fire off 11 turd keys and grab the key. This was kind of relevant because in the gold run that I did, that was actually not on any ghost days, but because I realized that the Knob Shaft was a ghost zone, I was still able to leverage 11 ghost keys there.
The main thing that makes me curious is I think the 2 items of the month that we got directly after LKS would have been, I mean, let's be clear, maps and cargo are fantastic. They're really, really good items of the month with a lot of cool ways to use them. But I think that in low-key summer especially, these would have completely handled a lot of the most painful parts of runs. Do you guys want to go into any detail about how your routes might have changed if you actually had these two items available for you for low-key summer?
Would have given me peace of mind that my run wouldn't be thrown at the last minute with a 19-turn hole in the sky.
I would have just used maps to guarantee the What's and Ghost.
Guaranteeing a ghost, and we didn't talk about it too much, but that zone is actually pretty punishing when it comes to monster count. I believe there's 6 ghosts in there, maybe 5.
Yeah, I had to use 2 banishes in there before I found the first one. Then I used the 4th.
I think the one thing I did want to do before we wrapped up and got to Grey Goo was talk through, I think, 2 questions that we got on Low-Key Summer. First one being, what do you guys think was the MVP item of the month for Low-Key Summer?
Camel for me. It enabled your turd key strategy, free runs from the smoke bombs. I used it in my softcore run for 245 combats. My most used familiar by a long shot.
I think that I would agree with you on that. I think that the camel was the MVP for me. What about you, Tess?
Yeah, I'd say so too. We all had really great uses for the camel. I don't remember if you mentioned it or not, but I spat on the stone wool sheep as my hidden temple decision.
I think that was the last thing that I wanted to cover too, was just like, what do you guys think was the most degenerate strategy that you used in the Low-Key Summer Path? Mine, I think I mentioned earlier, was that I made the calculation that with 3 whole days of pizzas, you really start hitting the bottom of the barrel on the last few effects, and I realized that you could save the turn that you would spend fighting Baba Baran if you simply eat 2 stone-faced pizzas, which allowed me to save the turn on Baba Baran and still unlock the hidden city. And also, somewhat helpfully, not spend any stomach on a fortune cookie. So I got a full 15 pizzas in my gold hardcore run.
I wouldn't call it degenerate, but I really enjoyed pulling a question juice in my softcore run to use that as a pizza ingredient for a 34-turn Disquiet Riot pizza.
We're going to be talking a little bit more about avatar potions in a few minutes. Tess, what was your favorite? Was it the pirate stuff? Because that was fantastic.
Yeah, that was just a really wacky way to use resources that you normally weren't going to use in a way that nobody else expected.
As I did not take part in the Grey Goo Challenge Path, I will not be participating in the following discussion, but we have another guest that is worth a whole bean. Hello, Bean.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to hear what you guys have to say about Goo.
Let's talk through the Grey Goo Challenge Path. So I'll give a brief path summary, and then we'll start talking through some of the routing differences across our runs and just the overall landscape of Goo. The basic path summary is that it is a path where you don't have to do anything. You can just sit, you can ascend into Grey Goo, not touch KOL for 2 days, and ascend on your 3rd day. There is absolutely nothing that you have to do for the path. There isn't a single quest that you need to do. There isn't a single thing you need to click. It is very much a, hey, have you never done a 3-day ascension before? Well, here is the easiest possible way to do that. However, you can get Goo. How would you guys describe what happened to the nearby plains in the Goo path?
The intro text, which I actually really liked the writing on the non-combat that you get right after you ascend. The intro text, which ended with the button. It ended with the text, "This can't be good," and then the button said, "It can be Goo though," which just made me very happy every time I saw that. So what the intro text says is that the nearby plains have been hit by a Goo meteor, and kind of everything has just been Goo'd. And so you are not able to access anything that you would normally get to in the nearby plains. And similarly, the tower, it's like 2 tiles on the main map. And so the tower has also been Goo'd and is in the nearby plains equivalent. And so that grows over the course of 3 days until on day 3 it just becomes the astral gash without you having to do anything.
Mechanically, this was 10 different zones in which you had to max 1 or 2 different stats to fight Goo monsters of increasing size for Goo point. And this was all the rage for about 3 days before we realized that the massive prism of Grey Goo gave you Goo based on the lowest amount of elemental damage you did split across the 5 elements.
We aren't going to be talking about these other zones very much for the rest of the podcast, but let's briefly introduce kind of what the zones were. So the Cobb's Knob became a zone where your goo was scaled on sleaze resistance and food drop in a kind of multiplicative formula. There were two other multiplicative formula zones, the goo-covered bat hole and the goo-covered garves, both of which were, much like the knob, it was a combination of resistance with a percentage metric. In the case of the bat hole, stench res and minus combat. In the case of the garves, spooky resistance and plus combat. In addition, you had the goo-coated funhouse, which was an HP zone, the Tower Ruins, which was an MP zone, the Beanstalk, which was initiative, and the Palindome, which was monster level. You also had a kind of separate zone, which was the goo fields. Unlike the rest of them, there wasn't a turn limit on the goo fields. However, there was no way to increase the amount of goo that you would get from the individual monsters. So that zone was basically only used if you wanted to create a funny number at the end of your run and make sure that you hit the exact number that you wanted to use. In the early days of the path, we were really trying to figure out, like, okay, well, how are we going to want to route these tests together? Are we going to want to do, sleaze res first, then do stench, then do etc.? But at the end of the day, Grey Goo was not about any sort of routing of the goo zones. It was about one thing, and that was hitting the prism as hard as you possibly could over, honestly, just 2 fights. The first day's prism fight, at least in, I don't know about you guys, I'm pretty sure that it was the same for everyone. The first day's prism fight was barely better than a power leveling turn. It was definitely better, but the margin was so low that you could be excused for completely skipping the first day's goo prism fight.
And in several cases, I did on several. I think both of my, at least one of my top leaderboard runs, I did just entirely forget to fight it the first day.
Why is that, Bean? So why is it that you have something that is the most important thing in the path, you only get 3 fights against it because you can only fight it once per day? Why is it okay to completely skip one of those 3 fights?
It's kind of tied into the weird way that you have to use resources on this path. Because you are trying to deal a lot of damage to the prism, you want to be as high of a level as possible. So in effect, you are looking for ways to, since spell damage, we figured out pretty quickly that the most efficient thing to do was going to be to deal spell damage, use elementally, some combination of the Hobopolis 120 spells to deal a lot of damage in, over, if you get 11 rounds, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, you can the easy strategy is just rotate through the 10 spells and use 2 of each. And so you just want as much mysticality and as much bonus spell damage as you can find. And there are a couple other things you can add into that formula. But the way it works out is that you want to use your 15 pizzas across the 3 days, or 18 or 20 in softcore, you want to direct all of those resources towards your later fights, because your first few fights are going to be are just not going to be that strong because your mysticality is so much lower, and you want to, because of the way the math works out, you kind of, it's just much better to direct your day 1 resources towards leveling. So you want to be doing things like making big stat buff pizzas. You want to be doing things like making different way of seeing things, which is the snapper drop, the non-Euclidean angle. The buff is different way of seeing things. It gives you 50% missed experience, and so that's the way that's just the way the numbers balance. You want to be using your resources to level on the first day. Once you decide that you're using your resources to level and not deal damage to the prism on the first day, it quickly kind of all falls apart, and you realize that it is correct to put absolutely 0 resources into the prism that you could use elsewhere on the first day. So you don't use any pizzas on that. You use all of you move your potions around such that you're using your potions on different turns than the prism fight, and ultimately it ends up being, even in both hardcore and softcore, just like, maybe it's like worth as much goo as 3 or 2 power leveling turns would be worth. So it's like it's like a, fighting the prism is like generating an additional 1 or 2 turns. So it's really it's just not very strong on day one. Just kind of the way, if you follow the path of like what the correct resource usage is.
I think just about everyone had a kind of aha moment when we all realized, oh, the day one prism is completely useless. Tess, so in LKS we talked pretty extensively about how Seal Clubber was the correct class for speedrunning. Was there a correct class for Goo, and why?
The breakout, most popular, most effective class for Grey Goo was Saucer. Although there were a couple of Postamancers on the leaderboards after the 15th, Saucer was just oppressively strong. You get triple potion crafting, you get mist focus, as well as a lot of other silly marginal things that no other class had any chance of matching.
I remember early in the path, I made one of my class selection benefit spreadsheets, and it just very quickly became obvious, like, okay, mist class is going to be the right answer. And then when we realized there were several other key advantages for Sorcerer, mainly the minus 10 ML that you would get on day 3, it was too much. There was no way any other class was going to jump Sorcerer for speedrunning.
I did have a thought at one point, due to something that we'll discuss a little later, that the Postamancer might be correct, but ultimately it was not.
At a high level, Grey Goo is about power leveling. You wanted to get your adventurer to as high a level as possible so that when you finally fight your day 2 and 3 prism, you were just obscenely high level relative to where you would be in a normal path. Looking at the Grey Goo logs, in softcore, we normally got to around 1,700 or 1,800 in terms of main stat. In hardcore, you still got well over 1,000 main stat. How do you accomplish that in the number of turns you've got till your day 2 prism?
So the biggest answer is that you need to spend a lot of turns at the never-ending party. If you just decide to spend, I mean, much like how you would power level in Aftercore, you just basically crank your main stat percentage as high as you can. You use as many percentage XP buffs as you can find, the big one here being the non-Euclidean angle, and you just spend every turn you can there. So, every ounce of turn gen you could find was also really helpful to get, especially in softcore, to get more turns power leveling. There were like a million places that you would find little pieces of power leveling assistance. And there's also this like long tail of skill perms that you can use to help. So you would want to run Song of Bravado, which is the dread skill, that gives 15% stats. You want to run Steve Dave's Shanty of Superiority, which is the accordion thief song that's 10% stats that you would basically never run in a normal run, and use Glittering Mascara the entire time. So there's like all this just like long tail of stuff that you do to juice up your power leveling a little bit more. And I'll leave it to Tess to talk about the use of the other goo zones, since I think he used them more effectively than I did. Really, it's just about figuring out how each turn in the never-ending party can be maximized as much as possible. There's like a convenient thing in a lot of the kind of spreadsheeting we were doing, and I think the spreadsheets were really important in this path to figure out what the right resource usage was. In a lot of our spreadsheeting, it was pretty important that the way the math works out, each turn at the never-ending party with a constant, if you assume that your stat percentage plus stats and your percentage plus XP is constant, each turn gives you exactly the same absolute number of main stats. So like a marginal turn in softcore would just give you like 1.5 base main stats roughly. If you had the kind of in softcore, if you had the normal kind of softcore pulse that I had. And so there's, it's really just all about spending every turn you can there. There was a complication there, which is that on day 2 in softcore, you would start to hit the cap. So NEP only scales to 20,000 main stat, and after that, the monsters just stay at 20,000 main stat. So a big dynamic in kind of really pretty high level runs is that you would hit the cap at NEP, and you would have to figure out how to distribute your resources over the day to make sure that you were Keeping just below the cap would be like the optimal resource usage, and then just fighting, because once you're above the cap, you're starting to waste your plus stat percent buffs. So that was a really important dynamic and something that was quite tricky to manage technically, in softcore especially.
Being you alluded to this, but Tess, one of the big differences in your route versus the ones that I think I used, and I believe looking at Bean's route being used as well, was that you leveraged the goo zones much more effectively to help jumpstart your power leveling. Can you describe a little bit about kind of how you did that and what that kind of means?
So in hardcore, I found the problem that I actually couldn't hit level 8 early without going into the NEP. Going into the NEP was not a good idea because that meant I had to start spending resources on mist buffs, and then if I came back to Mount McLarge I would be wasting as many as 6 turns on just regular combats and stuff. So what I did was use Googs to hit level 8 and beyond. And this was really important in hardcore because at the start, a Goog with plus 100 monster level was basically a 1000 stat monster, and those were going to be bigger than quite a few net fights. Later on, I made this even weirder because I started doing a couple of beanstalk fights to hit level 8, and then once I did that, I could spend 3 clovers in the mine for ore, get my goat cheese, get the potion of temporary greatness, and then start with goo. And this was really cool because that meant I could save the net plus 20% experience buff as well as different
way of seeing things.
I could use those on the Googs, and then that would also help kickstart the NEP even further on top of the 10 free combats that you would be getting there, plus the 10 or so sausage relativity fights.
There was a lot of weird kind of, hey, I want to try and get to as high as I possibly can before a NEP, but I want to reserve a bunch of resources. I know one weird decision that I ended up making in my route was I basically, to try and make sure that my camel was charged before NEP so that I could use sombrero for the majority of NEP, I ended up using my bottle of champagne on a bunch of early drops so that I would be able to run the camel and still cap a bunch of very dumb little things I needed for pizzas. Did either of you do a similar kind of, okay, well, I'm not going to really be using champagne the rest of the day, so I'll just use it to make my camel basically like a fairy?
In both hardcore and softcore, I found that I needed pizza ingredients from the haunted kitchen, which is something that was very strange to me. I found that there was an interesting strategy that Tess told me at the very end of the path that I didn't get to use, involving filigreed amethyst necklaces. But you really wanted, in my hardcore route, I really wanted a lot of Fs for different way of seeing things pizza, which is DIF. And so I needed to get, I figured out that the best place to find these was fricasseed brains from the zombie chef in the haunted kitchen, which is, the first zone I went through in my route. And so I would, in the last iteration of my route, I would, in hardcore, map a zombie chef, olfact it, and then fight it with, use some combination of autoscopes and champagne bottles on it. And then similarly in softcore, I needed a lot of A's for mellowed out pizzas. And I think, Scotch, your route was used mellowed out in hardcore as well, but I did not. So in softcore, I would then do the same with a demonic icebox, and those were all 20% drops. So I would need to use pretty significant resources as I was charging my camel at the same time.
That was pretty much what I did as well, with the exception that instead of using the autoscope, I used the vampire capes bat form for plus 100%. This wasn't enough to cap the fricasseed brains from the zombie chef, but it was consistent enough that I could also use the cloud form to try and get through the kitchen in as few turns as possible.
One of the nuances that you just sort of alluded to a bit, Bean, was the farming of non-Euclidean angles. And I think this is so at a high level, as we sort of described, Goo was pretty simple. You spent turns at Neverending Party, anywhere from 400 to 500, depending on, well, 400 to 500 in softcore, about 200 to 300 in hardcore. But you also wanted to have different way of seeing things, the snapper buff on for basically the entire time. There are two ways that you can get the snapper buff. The first is that you spend a pizza on it. The second is that you just farm up a ton of those snapper drops. In my route in particular, I definitely worked pretty heavily around trying to get a specific number of those drops so that I only had to use a specific number of diff pizzas. How did you guys approach the idea of snapper farming? Did you do it? Did you just kind of decide, pizzas and poles are a perfectly fine way to get over this? What was kind of the calculus that you guys both did there?
So I think for me, I think this was just a failure of my spreadsheets, but I didn't really farm any non-Euclidean angles except as the result of a mistake where I had miscounted my turns in hardcore on my last hardcore run. So I had to, at the end of day one, I discovered I was like, did not have the right number of turns of different way of seeing things set up for the next day, because I had just, misadded. And so I had to like just jump over into and at this point I didn't know about the outskirts of Camp Logging Camp weird, so I ended up just going to the third floor of Spooky Raven, which is kind of the area we'd been discussing since the beginning of the path for finding weirds, and farming a couple of those. But they didn't really figure in my route, and I think the softcore leveling indicates that your plan was probably the best, Scotch, in terms of what to do there. I think there's still some question about how many you wanted to farm in hardcore. I'm not entirely convinced that you wanted to farm a whole ton of them, but I haven't really done the math out, so that might be correct. Tess and I did have a conversation on the like second to last day of the path, or third to last day or something, where we realized that outskirts of Camp Logging Camp lets you consolidate two of the pre-NEP tasks. So the two things you wanted to do were, if it was in your plan, farm non-Euclidean angles, and also you needed to get a bunch of sticks of firewood for the campfire. So you could buy a Whittled Wand, because Whittled Wand is 100% spell damage, and it's also 10% spell critical hit. And a key strategy for the Prism was capping your spell critical percentage, so everything was a critical hit. You can consolidate those two tasks, which I think ultimately probably would have been right, because you're just saving a whole bunch of turns that way. And also the farming the firewood is just like a really annoying, like high RNG task, which in many of our runs I think ate up like way more turns than it should have in expectation. So that was a little bit frustrating, but in my actual runs I did not really do any non-Euclidean angle farming.
Hardcore, what I did was use all of my diff pizzas near the end of day one, subtracting 71 turns from the total duration, and then eating that many turns early at the mid-end of day one. This ended up not being the best strategy, as Bean started describing. The route that most people worked with was going into the Haunted Kitchen, Billiard's Library, to open up the second floor, and then using the Friars and possibly Spooky Forest to gather firewood, and then going into Pirate Realm, and then potentially power leveling until level 8, going to get your ores, doing Goat Cheese and the Potion of Temporary Greatness, and then looping back to the Neverending Party for pretty much the rest of your turns. This was not the best strategy. We should have been doing, and which nobody really ended up doing, was before level 8, before doing any goo zones, you should be boosting plus combat to 20%, using the snapper for weirds in outskirts of Camp Logging Camp to get the beard whiskers, banishing the other 3 monsters and sniffing and whatever, and then doing 6 or so angles in there, which would cost enough turns that you could consistently get your whittled firewood, and then devoting your pizzas to Mallowed Out and so on. This is extra relevant not just because of the whittled wands, but because for 10 firewood, you could get the whittled owl for plus 25% mist and plus 20 monster level, which would have been great for the Nep, as well as for your Googs. The plus 25% for the owl accessory is significantly better than the next best thing you could have gotten, which was either the Driftwood bracelet or the voter sticker for plus 5% mist.
I will say, to call myself out here, I did technically do that in my last hardcore run. Unfortunately, that hardcore run was destroyed for reasons that we will discuss later, as me and Bean commiserate over our last day of Path crushing failures that happened at about 11 p.m. that night, about 5 minutes from each other. Having gone over a bit of the leveling, let's actually go into a little bit more detail about the Prism fights. One thing that we realized probably about a month before the end of the Path was that you don't actually have 10 rounds with the Prism, you have 11. Bean, do you want to go into some detail about why that is?
This is one of the things that I think was interesting to me as someone who's trying to play this path pretty seriously. But, my account is old, but I am effectively much newer to the game than either of you are, I think. So I sometimes have it's one of the disadvantages that generates is just that I miss stuff that people have in the back of their heads. So I tried in the very beginning of the path, didn't realize, even though the fight ends on round 11, or maybe it's round 12, you get to attack on round 11. Round 0/1, and I still don't remember exactly what the right numbers are here, you can get an auto attack, and so that auto attack lets you get an 11th round against the Prism, which is actually pretty important for reasons that relate to elemental tuning effects. I had done a bunch of spading early in the path, and in maybe mid-September, I realized that this was something that they fixed, unfortunately, before I could use it and get an asterisk, but I realized in mid-September that you could actually stun the Prism, use a multi-round stun on like round 10 if it was going to explode on round 11. And it would stop it from exploding, and then you would get, if you used a 5-turn stun, which I think there are a few of that are available, you could have then fought up to basically, get 25 rounds or so with the Prism, which would have been incredibly strong, but ultimately they fixed it because that was not actually intended. But the auto attack was something that I tried back early in the path and then again in September, but there's a checkbox in the settings that you have to turn on for it to use auto attack against bosses and special monsters, and because this one is, I think, a boss, you have to have that checkbox on. So when I tried it, it did not work, and so I was convinced for the first 2 months of the path that you could only get 10 rounds, and then someone in, I think it was Brett42, just noticed in the channel that just dropped in the channel that you could use auto attack against it, and I was just very confused at the time, which was kind of funny and a little bit humbling.
Now let's talk about what the Prism fight actually entailed. We already went over the basics, but not the actual how to do the most damage. So obviously you had to boost your mist, your spell damage, your base mysticality, but there were also just layers of really silly things you could do to boost damage. The first of these was figuring out that capping spell crit at 91% or higher meant that all of your spells were doing double damage. The second was figuring out that negative monster level was really good, and this played out fairly differently in hardcore and softcore. And then there were just a series of increasingly stupid pulls that you could use in softcore.
So one pull in particular that I think we all figured it out independently, and then eventually it got posted in the channel, and we were all like, okay, yeah, that's fair. This was not going to stay non-public for long. Was the Dark Baconstone Ring. It is crafted with black gold, something that you get from the Black Forest quest, which is not accessible in Goo, as it does require a zone in the plains. I don't think I mentioned this early on. There are quests accessible in Goo. It is different from community service in that way. And what that means, though, is that all quests that do not touch the plains are available, and every quest that has a component in the plains is not. So the level 11 quest isn't available, the Crypt quest isn't available, the Knob quest isn't available, etc. Having said that, the Dark Baconstone Ring is a accessory that you never use in any normal run, and frankly I had never used in KOL at all. I didn't even have one. That makes your crits worth 3x spell damage instead of 2x. Which is pretty good. when
Yeah.
it comes to doing a lot of damage. Another really good one was the Novelty Belt Buckle of Violence, which is
The Postamancer Shub Jiguat reward.
the belt buckle does a cool thing where it basically every fight your belt buckle is going to reflect some amount of your spell damage. I believe it's 10%.
Yeah.
Back on the enemy that you're fighting. Now, the cool thing about this 10% is that it doesn't have, it kind of double counts minus monster level. Tess, do you want to go into some brief detail on that?
Anyone who does high skill Ascension will know that increasing monster level reduces the amount of damage that monsters take. And what this means is that giving monsters negative monster level actually increases the amount they take. In softcore, where you could get as high as negative 310% monster, or negative 310 monster level against the Prism, you would basically be getting more than double multiplier against your raw damage, and then the buckle records that damage and deals that damage again, and it gets multiplied by negative monster level a second time.
So what it ended up occurring was that instead of being just a flat 10%, it ended up being more like, I don't think it was 20%, but it was a very high multiplier on your actual damage.
Probably like 30% actually.
So in addition to that, Bean, were there any other equipment items that were particularly useful, especially prior to the cape? Because I do want to talk about how weird the cape made everything.
It was right to pull a Staff of the Roaring Hearth, which is just like a plus 250% spell damage chef staff, or at least I thought it was. I don't know if you guys do, but the really weird one that was kind of annoying in softcore was the meteorite necklace, which is one of these like, it comes from the meteorite fragment, which is this like ultra rare drop from the beachcomb that you can find if you comb the beach forever. And so, those are worth something around generally on the order of like 600 to 800 million meat in the mall, and so they're not really super accessible. So they're developed this kind of weird sharing economy where a couple people were just loaning out meteorite necklaces for people to do runs. So I want to, publicly thank Kenny Kamikaze for doing a lot of that, and also a few other people loaned me and other people meteorite necklaces who have not been around for as long and don't have the kind of meat to just buy a 800 million meat item. So that was the reason that accessory is so strong, is that it's plus 25% mist experience, and you can just wear it the whole time. So it's like a free huge boost to your power leveling. There's also the government issued necktie, which is also a plus 10%, which is also a very strong pull. But that one's much easier to get. It's just a voter derivative.
Having gone into a little bit of detail about some of the weirder polls, I do want to give a highlight to two polls that were a key part of the pre-Cape Prism and were not used in our final runs. So these are the Gabardine Garibaldi and the Fiberglass Frock. So these are both Ascension rewards from the last 3 years. The Fiberglass Frock, what it does is it essentially will take the cold damage that you've done over your entire combat, and it will give you a percentage of that every turn. So if you cast a Sauce Geyser on the first turn, the Frock will every turn after that give you, I believe, is it 5% or 10% of the
10%.
overall 10% of the overall cold damage that you've done every round. And it will continue to add the actual damage that it itself has done every individual run. What this meant is that I think everybody that was running the path seriously had one or two weird spreadsheets where we were like, okay, what is the exact damage decay on the Fiberglass Frock? How many casts of cold do I actually need for it to match what we're doing with everything else? The other thing that was particularly useful was the Gabardine Garibaldi, which, if I remember correctly, doubled the damage of Sauce Geyser, which effectively made Sauce Geyser worth 2 hobo spells, which was very useful for actually cheesing the damage up on one or two of your kind of worst elements.
So what you had to do was equip a lot of negative monster level on top of your regular damage boosters, and then auto attack with a cold hobo spell. And this would be the only instance of cold that you would have to do, because the Frock would compound enough damage to actually equal way more than your other sources. You would do that, and then you would actually pull an ingot turtle. You would attack with Soul Blaze, and then a Gabardine boosted Sauce Geyser for hot. You would use the ingot turtle, and then you would cast your other 3 elements. And this would take 11 rounds. And you would be able to get something like 1/3 more damage than if you just used all 5 hobo spells twice.
So my pre-cape strategy was that I would cast a hot mortar shell with my auto attack. I would use Soul Blaze. I would throw the ingot, and then I would use a Garibaldi doubled Sauce Geyser that was tuned to cold. And then that would kind of give me the rest of my cold damage over the rest of my turns. This ended up with the cold being kind of the limiting factor downwards, but as you said, it would give you an extra third to your damage. So it was a 30% boost on the overall damage you were doing. In the remaining rounds, I did 3 spooky casts, 2 sleaze casts, and 2 stench casts. Bean, did you do something similar to that, or did you have a slightly different route as well for the actual prism fight damage?
Thing you described is literally exactly what I had in my spreadsheet, although I never executed it because of the way the timing broke down between then and when the cape came out, and I actually had time to do runs. And also, I think it was because after we were talking, it kind of all discovered this strategy. I think, Tess, you had it first in mid-October. I only did hardcore runs after that until the cape came out, and this was not. There was no version of this that worked in hardcore just because of kind of weird artifacts of how the rounds shake out until the cape came out.
So we've danced around the subject enough. The superhero cape came out with about 14 days left in the path. One of the things the superhero cape did was it gave us a in-standard spooky lantern. Tess, what is a lantern?
A lantern, named after the Rainbow Green Lantern, is a thing that makes it so it copies the amount of spell damage you do and then reflects it in its element. You have the Rainbow Green Lantern for stench, the Snowmobile for cold, the Meteor for hot, Cape now for spooky, and then you also had a couple of pseudo lanterns in the Porcelain Pork Pie for Postomancer's spells in sleaze, and the Belt Buckle, which is prismatic-ish.
The way that this changed the optimal configuration is, first of all, the fiberglass frock was out. Obviously, a spooky lantern was going to be a better item on your back than something that reflected 10% of the damage. Something that reflects 100% of your damage is just going to be better, period. The other thing this meant is that you didn't need to spend any of your combat turns on spooky. Because you didn't need to spend any of your combat turns on spooky, that gave you 11 rounds to do damage with 4 elements. That actually works out really nicely. We talked a little bit about elemental tuning. When you tune a monster to a specific element, that means that spells with the damage that element is weak to are going to do double damage. What this means is that with hobo spells, you effectively only need 2 casts of the elementally weak hobo spells to match 3 casts with the elementally not weak hobo spell. So what this meant was that in both hardcore and softcore, if you farmed up enough of the stench grenades from Pirate Realm, you were able to literally just go in, do 3 casts of the 2 elements that the prism was not weak to, 2 casts of the elements that the prism was weak to, and then the 1 turn to throw that extra melty plastic grenade. What this effectively meant is that all prism damage before November 2nd was effectively going to be doubled. The scores that we were getting, the roughly like 4 to 8 million, we could get double that with a good run post-cape. There were a few mild kind of hesitant points there. Like there's a few things that you lose a little bit of because you have to lose some power leveling terms to farm up the melty plastic grenade. There's a few minor differences in routing, but that is also helped by the fact that you save the pull that you would normally be doing for the Balsam Barrel, because you can just get 30% missed from the cape regardless. How do we all feel about the path being completely changed in the last 14 days?
Kind of mad.
Same.
For both leaderboards, in hardcore, the best prior to the cape was something like 500k. At the end, it was 1.3 million. For softcore, most people capped out around 6.5 million. I hit 8.3 million. And then at the end, it was like 14 million. That was pretty depressing because that invalidated not only the numbers, but also the strategies that we were using to actually hit those numbers prior, involving the frock.
I was definitely pretty bummed that I wasn't going to be able to do any of the frock shenanigans in the last few weeks of the path. I thought that was a pretty fun usage of an Ascension reward. That said, I do think for me, I mean, obviously we all got good commendations on this. I feel the worst for people that, ran their runs in the middle of October, got what they thought were pretty safe shots at silvers or close to golds, and then either dropped off the silver board entirely near the end because they simply didn't have time for the path in November, or by that point were already burnt out. I mean, I know there were several intrepid speedrunners. I do want to call out a few of them here. Boba Fetta, Richard Rawl, I think Brett 42 actually did do a few great runs at the end. There were several folks that at the start of the path were extremely invested and created a lot of really, really good strategies that just didn't have time to run it in the last month. And as a result, I think some of them even ended up with bronzes, which is not ideal in my mind. The cape. Oh, God.
It's probably for the better that the cape existed. Because prior to this, I had a very, very awful strategy for doing the prism fight in hardcore, which was spending diabolic pizzas on insanity in hopes that I could tune the prism naturally, and then after hitting it with its weak elements, tune it again with the melty plastic grenade, and do basically twice the amount of damage that would have otherwise been possible in hardcore. This is a problem because on top of all the regular coin flips that you had to do with witch breaded, sparkly, and so on, Insanity was also a 1 in 2 chance versus a basically useless buff, and also getting the right elemental alignment was like a 2 in 60 chance.
We thought the random number, the coin flip was a lot more likely to land heads up, right, at the beginning when we were talking about this strategy, when you were first doing it, right? And then Dictator revealed at some point that it was, in fact,
even
much worse
than
we thought. Yeah. I didn't feel so bad about the cape so much as it just illustrating that maybe it would be better to have paths end on like the 25th or something of the month. I understand that they don't want it aligned with the month so that they're not testing a new path and an item of the month at the same time, but it would be nice to have it just shifted a little bit back, because I think if it had been the 25th, I wouldn't have minded so much.
Let's start getting to some of the questions about Goo. What do you guys feel was the most degenerate strategy you pulled in the path? Tess, I think your Insanity strat is almost certainly going to be the right answer there across all three of us. Love to hear your thought.
Well, it was the strongest in theory, but it didn't play out, so it doesn't really matter. The strongest strategy, in fact, was to rely on the fact that you pick your Arbitorium tree sapling correctly.
Yeah.
And then when Arbor Day shows up a couple of days before the end of the path, go in there and grab a Laughing Willow bark in hardcore for 200 turns of plus 100% mysticality.
Yeah, that one required you to predict the future, because the Arbor Day where you would have had to prepare that was before the path started.
That was absolutely incredible that you got that, Tess. I'm still shocked that I'm happy you got hardcore with that ridiculous prediction of the future there. I think the one for me, at least the one that felt the most degenerate, although I don't think it technically was the usage of the El Vibrato trapezoid in softcore. That was one that we theorized early in the path. I think a friend of the show, Akadorian, was one of the first ones to mention and call it out. And then we all kind of groaned internally, thinking, oh God, are we going to have to farm up El Vibrato in path? It didn't end up being quite that bad. What really happened was maps really helped us out here, as well as just the fact that by the end of the path, there just wasn't much that you were doing with your day 2 sabers. To give a brief summary of the El Vibrato strat, what you would do is that in the run before you do your Goo run, you would farm up an El Vibrato trapezoid. you would not use it. In your account, you're only supposed to be able to have one at a time.
You can get one per Ascension as long as your other ones are all in Hanks.
Hanks, that was it, yeah. I think it was like the display case doesn't work, Hanks does. There's a bunch of weird stuff there. Technically, you're not supposed to be able to kind of bring that forward. However, if you bank it from your previous Ascension, you can actually pull it. And what does pulling it get you? Well, it gets you two things. One, you get the buff Fitter Happier. This is a plus 100% mist buff that you get by throwing 2 specific El Vibrato punch cards at one of the monsters. The second thing is that you also get 100% spell damage from a potion that you get from getting another one of the El Vibrato monsters to build you a drone. What this ended up meaning is that you needed to get something along the lines of, I think, 6 punch cards.
You need 5.
5, yeah. 5 punch cards. You would basically use your macros on day 2 as much as possible to try and generate the monsters that you wanted. You would saber those monsters to get the punch cards you needed. You would throw them in combat to have those monsters build you a drone and buff you, and then you would escape that combat without actually spending the turn. So the El Vibrato Trapezoid ended up being a pull where you spent 0 turns in El Vibrato, but a ton of resources there to get 2 important buffs that helped cheese your Prism score just a little bit higher.
The actual effect of pulling the Trapezoid wasn't actually that high in retrospect. You only got plus 100% mist and 100% spell. At the end of the path, when we were truly allocating pulls, you could have just pulled something that gave you plus 100% mist if you didn't want to deal with this nonsense or you weren't prepared.
It was one of those things where you didn't necessarily need to do it, but by the time the path was near its end, I kind of just wanted to from hey, it's slightly better than the other potions that I'd be pulling in this space anyway.
Yeah, I have 2 kind of favorites here. My first favorite degenerate strategy was something that I realized, I think, and was actually, no, that's not true. I can't claim credit for this. Akadorian actually told me that this existed like a month before it was dumped into the channel, which is a Toxic Vengeance pizza. So you can pull an X-ray mirror, which is an avatar potion.
So just to give you the background on the X-ray mirror, it is an avatar potion, and it is not just an avatar potion, it is a ridiculously weird one, because it is an avatar potion you get while doing the Spelunky minigame inside of KOL.
Okay. I had no idea what it was. I just put it on my pull list.
It is the avatar potion for I believe the skeleton monster in the Spelunky minigame.
So it is the only X item available in standard that can be put into the pizza cube. And so you would pull that and pull a giant pearl or a pearl diver's necklace for more letters to make a Tox P pizza, which gives you 100 turns of Toxic Vengeance, which is effectively turning 2 pulls and a pizza into 300% spell damage, which is very, very strong. The other weird and degenerate strategy was at the end of each day in softcore, you could roll a pizza for, and sometimes in hardcore, you could roll a pizza for monstrosity, which is minus 25 monster level, but it's a 50% chance. And then either if you miss, you can look at the pizza and see what the effect's going to be before you eat it. And if you miss, you can eat an exotic jungle fruit that you've pulled, or if you can save it for when you are about to eat a melange or a ultra mega sour ball, and then only pull and use the melange or ultra mega sour ball if you hit on the pizza roll, and then roll over, the pizza disappears and you can make new pizzas tomorrow. So that was a way to try and get just a little bit more minus monster level, since minus monster level is so strong.
We almost forgot to talk about the actual pizza rolls.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Let's talk about those in the MVP item of the month question, which we'll do, I guess, right now. We talked about in the last path how the camel was the MVP item of the month for the challenge path. I think we can all probably agree that maps was the MVP item. Well, actually, I don't know. There's probably a good debate over whether cargo, maps, or cape was the most important. Cape obviously doubling the scores, although I hesitate to give it credit for that because I hate that it did it. The cargo had the Yeggs alarm clock, which was just absolutely massive. But I think that if we were all going to be completely honest, I think the Neverending Party is the real MVP item of the month for this challenge path. I think that it is the item of the month that got the absolute most usage, and it is the item of the month that you basically couldn't do the path without. One of the reasons for this was the van keys. Tess, you had great van key luck. Can you talk about how that, what that means and how that influenced your runs?
So, what you wanted to do for the nap was to sniff as many burnouts as possible for as many van keys as possible. What you could get from van keys included grapefruits, tangerines, exotic jungle fruits, roasted marshmallows, and some other marginally useful foods. The grapefruits were kind of useful because sometimes you couldn't get enough of them for 3 shots of 15 turns of plus 100% mysticality. The tangerines were especially helpful because those are 3 sets of 15 turns of 200% mysticality. You also had the exotic jungle fruit, which is a 1 fullness food that gave minus 25 monster level, basically an extra 10% prism damage. There was also things like the roasted marshmallow, which you could eat if you got the jungle fruit for marginally more mysticality, and so on. And I basically got all of those in more than a couple of runs.
I did not get my first helpful van key until my absolute last run, which then got ruined due to the last day of the path. Just absolute awful mistakes. Bean, do you have any other follow-ups on kind of like great items of the month? Or I guess one thing that you can talk about in terms of items of the month, I guess you could make an argument for the pizza cube over Nep in theory. I think, again, I don't know how you do with one without the other. I think you could probably pull off this path with Turnbloat and Nep without the pizza cube. I don't know whether you could pull it off the other way around. You did mention pizza rolls. Why did we add a pizza roll emoji to the server, and what do we mean when we're talking about pizza rolls here?
As anyone who has been paying attention to the pizza cube knows, if you have an effect where you have the prefix is ambiguous, so the key example here for this path was WITC, which is the beginning of both Witch Breaded, which is a 20% critical hit, 100% miss, 200% spell damage, is conflicted with Witch's Brood, which is basically useless prismatic damage effect. Because you needed to cap spell critical hit, and because high rolling it was just so good compared to your next best option, which is for getting a lot of spell critical hit, you kind of had to, if you were going for like gold, you had to roll for Witch Breaded and just accept that there was a 50% chance that you were going to waste a pizza. And several people, this never happened to me through my incredible luck, but several people's runs got just totally destroyed because they missed like 4 rolls in a row for Witch Breaded. And there were other rolls too, but that were just like nice, like SPAR for Sparkly and Sparkling Consciousness. But that one wasn't quite as critical if you missed it.
Missed like 6 witch breads in one run. That completely sank it.
And in a normal run, you would just, pizzas are so important and you plan them so precisely that you would just never roll for a non-guaranteed pizza pretty much. But the way this path was structured, it made sense.
Let's just do one high-level last question here. Did you enjoy this path? Tess, we'll start with you.
I thought it was something that is good that it exists, but definitely not something I would want for a very long time in the future.
I think I would have been happier with this path if it had been only 2 months. I just kind of started feeling pretty burned out of it by the end, and definitely was really excited about it in the beginning, and then just executing the thing over and over again, especially when one mistake on the last turn, which happened to me in my last softcore run on the last day of the path, can totally destroy your ability to do as well as you hoped to. That was it was just frustrating in a way that it doesn't happen in normal paths where you make a mistake and can waste like 2 or 3 turns usually. Here you could make a mistake and lose like 25% of your score or 30% of your score, which was quite frustrating and was not super fun. But I did enjoy the path overall.
I will be honest, I did not super enjoy the path. I will say, I think my favorite thing about this path is that it featured a bunch of stuff in the game that we don't usually feature. We got to see all of the weird ways that KOL lets you do damage, all of these weird effects that are just never useful. But at the end of the day, I kind of wish that there was more of a focus on, hey, you have to do all the Goo'd zones, or you have to do a quest, or some other something to create more interesting routing decisions than a run log that is literally just 70 turns in the Haunted Nursery, 400 turns in the Neverending Party, and 3 Prism combats. A little bit too one note for me, but that's just my taste.
One other thing I can mention is that I thought it was interesting how the path kind of had this wave of ups and downs between thinking that we had to go everywhere and then coming back to only the Neverending Party and a couple of key zones. And then at the very end, we realized that we had to go out to other zones again.
Eventual learnings in this path as you kind of got your power leveling down. And I will say, I do think that I will use this power leveling in the future to help make my community service score increasingly closer to 170. Anyways, thank you guys so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Tess, Bean, I know this has been a little bit longer than we anticipated, and I do not envy Lyft having to edit this later. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you all have a great day.